Author and poet Gary Soto talked with us at his home in California. Students from all over the country have read his stories, and some of these students recorded questions for Mr. Soto about the broken chain.
Why did you decide to write this story? And why did you choose this topic?
Well, in Broken Chain, it's a love story. It's a coming-of-age story about how a girl, actually is a boy longing for, his first girlfriend. And that's a universal kind of theme. And, all my work, tends to have, that as a major theme. I mean, love, for instance, or loneliness, or a sadness, or approaching death. I've written stories about that as well. And it's really not an uncommon kind of theme. That is first love.
I like how you use two languages instead of just English.
But I think with Spanish-speaking people, Mexican American, other Latinos, sometimes you might intersperse the use of Spanish, in talk, in a dialogue between one person and another. But I think those questions about language and identity are really important to young people. And so they count me as a Mexican-American writer. They count me as their writer. And that's really very touching, actually.
I think Alfonso doesn't believe in himself and has poor self-esteem.
I don't think characters in stories necessarily have to believe in themselves. I think one of the impacts of literature is that there's often self-doubt. Otherwise you have a world that's sugar-coated and everybody believes in himself or herself. And I think a lot of people do at that age of 10, 11, 12, 13 years old have self-doubts about their looks, about their social status, about things at school, their neighborhood. And so this is, in fact, a story about self-doubt. And if you thought you were, Mr. Romantic and you were going to go and conquer the world, then you may be deluding yourself. I think it's best for young people to doubt those experiences of first love, because that makes your throat clot up.
Is Raul greedy or just overprotective?
I don't think Raul is probably, he wants to lend his bike at a certain price to his friend, and I think it's just one way of trying to make some money in a neighborhood where there's really no way to make any money. And so it's sort of a trade-off. I will lend you my bike if you pay me a little something. And so it's not so much greed, it's entrepreneurial spirit, I think.
Why didn't he keep saving his money from lawn mowing and save for braces?
As a boy, I had some odd jobs. I used to do a lot of raking of leaves in Fresno, and I always had this goal of buying something really big and grand, like a bicycle or a skateboard, a set of clothes that would really make me splashy at school. However, every time I got paid, I would say to myself, I promise to keep this money. Of course, this was a promise that was broken almost daily, because I would see a candy bar I wanted, I would see a glider, or a kite, or a ball that I wanted, and I would immediately spend that money. And it's no different. Temptations of the world they're out there, and they could be in the shape of simply a candy bar, and that money, disappears very quickly.
I like how you described how the chain looked.
I do like this description. I have to say, as a writer, I do savor that description of this chain itself breaking and sort of almost being snake-like as it hits the cement. This is simply called description, and I think a writer has to have what they call a strong specification. And strong specification is where you paint a picture that might be common, but it's done in such a way that it adds freshness to that moment. Really, in fiction writing, you have description, thought, dialogue, exposition, and physical gesture. And one of the strengths of my writing, if I could praise myself here for a moment, is that I think of the descriptive passages that sort of leap on the back of the mind, so they're almost like movies in themselves.
Paterson, New Jersey is a city of many cultures. It is also the childhood home of author, poet Judith Ortiz Cofer. For the first time in 18 years, Judith returns to the city and the places that have had a profound influence on her life and her writing.
I lived here when the Puerto Ricans had first started coming over, and so this was a place where many families, even from the same town in Puerto Rico, came to live. When I saw the people and I saw their faces, when they said hello to me in 2 languages, and when I smelled the smells coming out of the grocery store and I saw the women in the beauty shop, I knew that life goes on. So I felt a sense of familiarity with the place. You know, it's no longer home, but it's the memory of home. This poem is set in a schoolyard, very much like this one at public school number 15. It was public school number 11, the grammar school before you came here to this campus. And it was about a time when I had just moved here during the winter from Puerto Rico, where it had been warm. I had been speaking in Spanish and had a lot of family around me. And now I felt like the outsider, the kid standing outside while the other girls played. But in this poem, it also talks about how my imagination allowed me to keep warm and to be a part of their game. Schoolyard magic. Leaning on the chain-link fence of PS number 11, my flesh cracking in the bitter breeze of a December day, I burrowed deep into my clothes and watched the black girls jump rope so fast and hot, my own skin responds. The greatest adjustment coming back to Paterson was our isolation. We spent a lot of time in the apartment when my father was away during the week because the streets were dangerous and because we had to make new friends every time we returned from the island. Drawing my hands free from all my winter foes, I clap until my palms turn red, joining my voice to theirs, rising higher than I ever dared. I attended St. Joseph's parochial school for 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. I'd never imagined coming back to this school. All of the memories came rushing back, like I stood at one end of the hallway and looked at the staircase that led out to the street, and I remember that so many conversations that I thought were very important took place at that entrance, you know, about boys, about teachers. That's where we stood to wait until the sisters told us to come in down the hall to the classroom. This classroom itself, I remember the light coming through the window, and I remember essentially where I sat. I was one of the first Puerto Ricans here. The rest were middle class, Irish and Italian, you know, immigrant children, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation. And so they had gone that one step further and moved out to the suburbs, or at least to nice areas. And I lived in the city core. But it was a mixture, because once I left the school, I was in a different world. I was in my Puerto Rican home, and I had my relatives and my mother and everything else. And so I learned to divide my life. And so I think that all came back to me, you know, as a very strong memory when I walked in the door. The library, particularly the library here in Paterson, was a stunning sight to me. You would leave your neighborhood and walk for a few blocks. There would arise in front of you this building with columns, a huge building to a little girl, and with the words of the philosophers carved on the walls, and you felt as if you were entering some kind of cathedral. To me, books were riches. To be able to read anything I wanted. I remember I became addicted to stories from Asia, China, and Japan, and finding out that there were cultures older than ours. And began to understand that knowledge was vast. That's where I learned it, at the Paterson Public Library. I read once that there is nothing more calming or soothing or hopeful sounding than the sound of falling water. my family, when we got together after Mass on Sundays, sometimes we'd ride out here just to sit down. And my father liked to talk to us out here. He liked to talk to us about plans. And I think that he had a sense of the environment. We lived in the inner city. There was noise and crowds. And I think that he liked to get us away where we could hear water and see trees and envision. And so I have memories of this place as a place of escape or refuge, a weekend place. But to us, it was a view of nature and I guess possibilities. I have lived away from Patterson for many years, but I still come back to it. Not because it was a negative or a positive experience, but because it made me a person. It made me what I am. I feel that learning to shift from one language to another, understanding two cultures and how to navigate through them, has made me a more complete person. And when I write, I can draw. I feel rich. I can draw from both places and put it in my writing, and also make a statement about what America is really becoming. We're all a mixture. There is no such thing as a pure American culture anymore. And the fact that this is a hopeful thing, not a negative thing.
Mr. President and Mrs. Clinton, Mr. Vice President and Mrs. Gore, and Americans everywhere. A rock, a river, a tree, hosts to species long since departed, marked the mastodon, the dinosaur, who left dry tokens of their sojourn here on our planet floor. Any broad alarm of their hastening doom is lost in the gloom of dust and ages. But today, the rock cries out to us, clearly, forcefully, "Come, you may stand upon my back and face your distant destiny, but seek no haven in my shadow. I will give you no hiding place down here. You, created only a little lower than the angels, have crouched too long in the bruising darkness, have lain too long face down in ignorance, your mouths spilling words armed for slaughter. The rock cries out to us today, you may stand upon me, but do not hide your face. Across the wall of the world, a river sings a beautiful song. It says, come, rest here by my side. Each of you, a bordered country, delicate and strangely made, proud, yet thrusting perpetually under siege. Your armed struggles for profit have left collars of waste upon my shore, currents of debris upon my breast. Yet today, I call you to my riverside, if you will study war no more. Come, clad in peace, and I will sing the songs the Creator gave to me when I and the tree and the rock were one. Before cynicism was a bloody sear across your brow, and when you yet knew, you still knew nothing. The river sang and sings on. There is a true yearning to respond to the singing river and the wise rock. So say the Asian, the Hispanic, the Jew, the African, the Native American, the Sioux, the Catholic, the Muslim, the French, the Greek, the Irish, the rabbi, the priest, the sheik, the gay, the straight, the preacher, the privileged, the homeless, the teacher. They all hear the speaking of the tree. They hear the first and last of every tree speak to humankind today. Come to me, here beside the river. Plant yourself beside the river. Each of you, descendant of some passed-on traveler, has been paid for. You who gave me my first name, you Pawnee, Apache, Seneca, you Cherokee Nation, who rested with me, then forced on bloody feet, left me to the employment of other seekers, desperate for gain, starving for gold. You the Turk, the Arab, the Swede, the German, the Eskimo, the Scot, you the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Crew, bought, sold, stolen, arriving on a nightmare, praying for a dream. Here, root yourselves beside me. I am that tree planted by the river which will not be moved. I the rock, I the river, I the tree, I am yours. Your passages have been paid. Lift up your faces. You have a piercing need for this bright morning dawning for you. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it into the palms of your hands. Mold it into the shape of your most private need. Sculpt it into the image of your most public self. Lift up your hearts. Each new hour holds new chances for new beginnings. Do not be wedded forever to fear, yoked eternally to brutishness. The horizon leans forward, offering you space to place new steps of change. Here, on the pulse of this fine day, you may have the courage to look up and out and upon me, the rock, the river, the tree, your country. No less to Midas than the mendicant, no less to you now than the mastodon then. Here, on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face, your country, and say simply, very simply, with hope, good morning.
The animal kingdom has an active communication system. By studying animal behavior, scientists have found that animal communication can be sophisticated and exact. A honeybee performs an intricate dance after searching for food. Through the figures and speed of the dance, the worker bee indicates the exact direction and distance of the potential food source. After much study, scientists have been able to unravel the mystery of the honeybee's waggle dance, but we're not so clever when it comes to more difficult animal communications. Like human mothers, humpback whales sing to their babies and to other whales in the pod. What is she telling them? Animal communication among their own species is as unique as English is from French, Russian, or Greek. One of the most common animal messages, and the easiest for us to understand, is fear or danger. Researchers studying the black-footed ferret in Montana observed this unusual dance. The ferret's movements alert his neighbors to the danger of a predator nearby. But if we saw a coyote and wanted to warn the ferrets, how could we let them know? How would they understand our warning signal? Our first efforts in communicating with animals began with pets and beasts of burden. Dogs, cats, oxen, and horses, for example. Tame animals are trained to respond to voice commands, hand signals, or specific sounds. In some situations, careful training becomes vitally important. This police dog must follow his trainer's commands exactly, or his trainer could be placed in a life-threatening situation. While animal training may not be true communication, a strong bond forms between trainer and animal. Through that bond, a level of mutual understanding exists. A companion dog is a good example of a bond between animals and humans. The dogs are trained to help their owners lead full and productive lives. Yet the connection between the owner and helper is more than just a working relationship. The bond between the owner and dog is real, but it is not actually communication. We've all seen TV shows and movies where people talk to animals, and the animals talk back. Is this fiction based on fact? Research with dolphins shows us that the ability to learn, reason, and think is not limited to human beings. Dolphins have large brains, a complicated communication system, and quick minds. These two dolphins, Phoenix and Achaia Kamai, have lived at the Kewalo Basin Marine Mammal Lab since they were very young. It is important to understand that the actions you see are not trained behavior. The teachers speak to the dolphins using hand signals, and the dolphins decide what response to give. Now the basis of real communication begins. The trainers give a list of directions, like find the surfboard and turn it over. Much too easy. The dolphins have no trouble at all reasoning out what to do. Once the trainers know that the dolphins can complete a set of directions, the trainer asks Achaia to do a task that is impossible to fulfill. Achaia's answer to the problem surprised the scientists. In the past, the dolphins would be asked to find a frisbee or some other item in the pool. If the frisbee was in the pool, they would respond to the yes paddle, showing that they had understood what was asked. If the frisbee was missing, the dolphins went over to the no paddle to say it wasn't there. Now Achaia was asked to take one item that was in the pool over to another, but the second item was missing. To everyone's surprise, Achaia picked up the first item and took it to the no paddle. She was saying, I can find the one thing, but the other is not here. Her answer was an invention on her part. She figured out a way to tell the trainers that only part of the problem could be solved. How much of what Phoenix and Achaia do is learned or reasoned? A window in the dolphin's tank lets the scientists do an interesting experiment. The dolphins watch a set of instructions on TV and react to them correctly. But suppose the trainers are replaced by white-gloved hands against a black background. Again, the dolphins are able to understand the directions and complete their tasks. Based on the variety of noises and signals they use, we know that dolphins have a language made up of a large vocabulary. We can't speak dolphin yet, but scientists are working on ways to decode the meaning behind their language. Nobody knows if or when we'll be able to talk to animals in the same way we talk to other people. Perhaps this is one mystery we'll never solve. But continued study of animals and their unusual languages may unravel the secrets behind an elephant's trumpeting, a coyote's midnight howl, and the chatter of a dolphin.
Science fiction author Ray Bradbury talks about his favorite topic, the future, how science fiction becomes science fact, and the things that inspired him early in life.
I like to ask people, what's the one subject we talk about every minute of the day, every hour of our life? There's only one subject, the future. What are you going to do an hour from now? What are you going to do tonight? What are you going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do with your life? Are you going to get married or you're not going to get married? You're going to go to school or you're not going to school. It's all the future. You're going to have a friendship or no friendship. You're going to love someone or not love someone. But it's all in the next minute, the next hour, the next day, the next year. That's all we ever discuss, every single second. And it's strange to me that there should be such a rejection of the future by so many people out there who think it's not important to talk about it. But that's all I feel like talking about, because I want to help us to survive. I didn't realize till a few years ago that the history of science fiction goes back to the cave. In other words, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we drew pictures on the walls of caves. What were those pictures about? Solving problems. Huh? The mammoth, the saber-tooth, fire. How do you build a fire? How do you keep it running? That's science fiction, isn't it? Then you find out how to build a fire, and that's science fact. You move on to the next set of problems. How do you kill a mammoth? We didn't know. We had to find ways of making weapons to kill a mammoth. That's science fiction becoming science fact. So science fiction began on the walls of caves, dreaming ourselves to survival day after day for 100,000 years. And those pictures are still on the walls of the caves. So we've changed the walls, but we're still drawing on them, aren't we? On the walls of Egyptian tombs, on the walls of Greek cities, and now on our computer walls. And we're doing the same thing. They're trying to solve problems so that we can behave better this morning so we can survive tomorrow afternoon. People say, what's the difference between fantasy and science fiction? Well, science fiction is the art of the possible, reality, physics, physical laws. Fantasy is the art of the impossible. You walk through a wall, you can't do that. You can knock a wall down with dynamite, and that's science fiction, huh? But you can't walk through it. So if people just remember that science fiction is based on the sort of thing described by William Butler Yeats in the last line of his poem, Sailing to Byzantium. He said, of what is past or passing or to come. Everything we've ever done with our ideas and our sciences, everything we're doing now, and everything we'll do in the future, of what is past or passing or to come. Not the impossible, but the possible. There was a year when we thought we'd never make it to the moon, and then finally we invented a heat shield, and we could come back. But we had to find a way to come back before we could go, huh? So that's the difference then. Fantasy is the impossible, science fiction is the very much possible indeed. The fascinating thing about writing science fiction is to discover your own root system. So I grew up with the Greek and the Roman myths and the Egyptian myths. And as I grew older and I read these stories, which have everything to do with all of our lives, all of our loves and our jealousies and hatreds and wars and what have you, I fell completely under their spell. And I look back on those periods when I was 10, 11, 12 years old as wonderful times. And when I finished the Martian Chronicles and reread it a year or two later, I said to myself, my gosh, didn't realize this is Greek mythology. This is the Roman myths. These are the gods come to the earth again. So we have to speak in metaphors. We speak in special tongues so that we will be remembered and we can simplify things. And science fiction does that. It makes metaphors of problems and hands them back to us, saying, you know, not only don't burn books, but love books. Be madly in love with books because they're worth loving. They're the excitement of ourselves. And we go to books to find ourselves in them. We don't go to find other authors. We go for mirror images of ourselves. And these are the myths then that the Romans spoke of and the Greeks spoke of that are immensely exciting this late in time. If I have one or two special lessons to teach, it's to stay in touch with the things that you love when you're very young. Because I fell in love with dinosaurs and the myths and legends of the dinosaurs, I've had a terrific life. I fell in love with Buck Rogers comic strips when I was 9. I began to write about landing on the moon when I was 12 and going off to Mars. So I started that way and I end that way. There's no difference between me in this very hour of my life than the 12-year-old boy that I was, 56, 57 years ago. The joy is still there. My love of Tarzan, John Carter, dinosaurs, toys, robots remains the same. And so you have a good life that way. And you don't listen to anyone else about your taste. It has to be completely your own. Your excitement, your joy, your loves, what you need to feed
on. Christmas, 1941. Almost all of the European continent had fallen to Nazi Germany's Blitzkrieg war machine. Most of the territory was occupied by German troops and subject to the authority of the ruthless SS and Gestapo. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the German advance on Moscow was halted by the bitter Russian winter and a fierce last-ditch Soviet counteroffensive. In the West, the nighttime bombing of London by the German Luftwaffe continued furiously, and the bombing of Pearl Harbor only weeks earlier had brought the United States into the war. World War II was now truly a global conflict. On January 20th, 1942, Hitler and a select cabinet met at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, but not to plot military strategy. They met to plan the final solution to the Jewish question. Since the beginning of the Nazi Party, one of their core beliefs was that the Aryan, or true German race, must be purified so Germany could recapture its rightful position as Europe's leader. The final solution agreed to at Wannsee was to eliminate all of Europe's Jews. Those fit to work would be sent to labor camps. Those unable to work would be killed immediately. Waves of Jews were rounded up and packed into railroad cattle cars for transport to concentration camps.
The trip was unbelievable. I cannot describe you that horror, what was going on in that train. And finally, after 4.5 days when we arrived, we had to get off from the train very fast. That was night. And when the door was opened, they were screaming at us, "Schnell, schnell."
Of the 3,000 people that arrived each day at Auschwitz, only 400 were selected for labor.
As I was standing there, not knowing what's going on and screaming all over the place and barking, the dogs were barking, I saw my father standing there with the man, so miserable. I have never seen my father the way he looked. He was a tall man, 6'2", very strong, and he always knew what to do. That was the first time I ever saw him not knowing what to say. And I felt so sorry for him. I wanted to run to him and hug him and say something encouraging when the SS stepped before me with his rubber stick, pushed me back and screamed at me that I should get back to the group where I was standing. So I couldn't even say goodbye to my father.
And then they showered us. They let the water on. They disinfected us. And then they took us out and they gave us some striped clothes. And I think we were numb. We just didn't know what's going on. And then they marched us to the barracks.
The barracks were long, huge barracks. Cold. All I had is no underwear, just a striped suit, which was very thin, very cold. And we had to stay. We got a piece of bread once every 24 hours, 48 hours, excuse me, with a little coffee. And sometimes we would get a little soup, which was practically water. And the kapos and the head of the barrack was very brutal. He was beating people.
More than 2,000 people were murdered every day.
The next camp was a men camp. So between us was electric wires, but you could look over. And there were a man like a skeleton with a white sheet over sitting, and he was singing all day long. Gorgeous, beautiful opera. He was an opera singer. And I never forget how one SS got close to that fence and started to scream at him to stop and told him that, "Why are you singing? You are already half dead. How can you still keep on singing?" And that man was sitting there ignoring the SS completely, and he was just singing and singing till one day he disappeared.
On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies invaded France and began the liberation of Europe. The tide shifted against Nazi Germany. Despite imminent defeat, the final solution remained a top priority of the Nazis. The concentration camps continued to operate around the clock. 6 million Jews, 3.5 million Russian and Polish prisoners of war, 400,000 gypsies, and thousands of others, all murdered by the Nazis right up until the camps were liberated by Allied forces.
Somebody walks in, he says, "The Americans are here." And then another man came in who could walk. He says, "The British are here. The English are here." I couldn't believe it. And a few people came in, he says, "Yes." And all of a sudden, I would hear loudspeakers go, "You are free," in different languages, in the Yiddish language, in Polish, in German, in French, different languages. "You are free. You are free."
After 35 years, silence, I just couldn't even talk about it. But after 35 years, the first time when I heard about that, there are people who are writing books about that the Holocaust never existed, or telling about these lies. I felt I do have to come out, no matter how hard is that for me, and I want to tell to the whole world. And my sister wanted to tell to the whole world. That was her last words, actually, to me, that to tell the whole world. So I really wanted to tell to people for the reason that should never happen again.
For all of his adult life, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a peaceful struggle to bring racial equality to America. But change has never been easy.
I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
The day after he spoke these words, the man who spent his life preaching peace died a violent death. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. Growing up, he discovered that America's promise of equality was not true for its black citizens. For people of color, water fountains for whites were off limits. So were white schools, white jobs, and even white friends. But Martin Luther King never let racist attitudes hold him back, starting with his education. He entered Morehouse College at age 15. When he was only 18, he became a minister in his father's church. He graduated at the top of his seminary class and then earned a PhD in theology. In spite of all these personal accomplishments, Martin Luther King still faced discrimination as an African American, but he was about to do something about it.
Just the other day, one of the fine citizens of our community, Mrs. Rosa Parks, was arrested because she refused to give up her seat for a white passenger.
In many cities in the 1950s, African American citizens had to ride at the back of the bus. When Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus, Dr. King organized a bus boycott.
At present, we are in the midst of a protest. 90% at least of the regular Negro bus passengers are staying off the buses, and we plan to continue until something is done.
It was the first time an entire black community had come together to fight for their rights, and they did so peacefully, even when Dr. King was arrested, and even when his home was bombed.
We still have the attitude of love. We still have the method of passive resistance, and we are still insisting emphatically that violence is self-defeating.
that he who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.
It took 11 months, and in the end, the black community did win. The United States Supreme Court ordered the buses to desegregate. Martin Luther King wanted to change many things about this country that he saw as unfair to African Americans, and he wanted to make these changes peacefully. He led nonviolent marches, sit-ins, and freedom rides. Civil rights protesters faced arrests, and fire hoses, and tear gas, and police dogs, and even beatings. But Dr. King set an example of peaceful perseverance. The news media publicized the struggle for civil rights and highlighted Dr. King's efforts. His leadership in the struggle had long been recognized by the African American community. And in 1964, the rest of the world recognized it too, when Dr. King became the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
The Nobel Peace Prize.
Some people saw Dr. King's nonviolent approach as weakness, but he had faith in the American system of law. He believed that change could come if Americans could understand the injustice of segregation.
Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
His nonviolent approach brought that dream within reach. When black protesters refused to strike back, Americans of all races were outraged by the attacks. That increased the number of people who supported civil rights, and that put pressure on politicians, who then passed new laws outlawing segregation and discrimination. When Martin Luther King died, he left behind his wife, Coretta Scott King, and 4 children. But he also left behind an example for us to follow. And he left a legacy of change that now benefits all Americans. The civil rights movement he helped establish for African Americans paved the way for others to claim their rights too, such as women, the disabled, and the elderly. Today, a national holiday honors the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., an American who changed America.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year.
The events in Longfellow's famous poem are widely accepted as a part of our country's history. But the historical account of Revere's ride differs significantly from the poem. The true story involves 2 other riders and a situation more dangerous than the poem describes. Literally on the eve of the Revolutionary War, all 3 of these riders risked death that night. So why did Longfellow turn Revere into a legend and leave the other 2 to history? As a poet, he had purposes different from a historian's. We'll look at the 2 versions of the story and try to discover the truth in each. Writing 80 years after America won political independence, Longfellow joined the fight for literary independence. He championed poetry of a national character, reflecting the unique experience of his young country. By comparing the story and the poem, we can see what Longfellow was trying to convey and how Paul Revere helped him do it. First, there is Revere himself. The Paul Revere behind the legend might have found a place in the history books apart from his midnight ride. He was a skilled silversmith whose work is displayed in art museums today. He was an engraver and a printer, and during the war, he printed money for the colonial government. He helped plan the Boston Tea Party and may have joined in.
He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch."
Revere, his friend at the church, and the other messengers were all part of an organized resistance movement. Revere led a spy network of his fellow craftsmen in Boston. Groups like this reported to the head of Boston's Committee of Safety. It was he who sent Revere on his mission to ride to Lexington and warn rebel leaders John Hancock and Samuel Adams of an impending attack.
1 if by land, and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be.
Far from the opposite shore, Revere was at home, preparing for his ride. The signal was intended for the Charlestown militia across the bay. Why would Longfellow report this little detail incorrectly? He was known to rely on books for much of his information. Perhaps he had heard or read an inaccurate version of the story and simply passed the mistakes along. This was the situation the night Revere rode. He was ambushed and had to change his route. Revere arrived in Lexington and delivered his message. Hancock asked Revere and another rider to alert the Minutemen in Concord. Along the way, they met a patriot from Concord who rode with them. Very soon, British soldiers surrounded them. Paul Revere was held and interrogated at gunpoint. Only the third rider reached Concord with the alert. So why didn't we hear about him in Longfellow's account? Well, in a sense, we don't really hear about Paul Revere in the poem either. Longfellow used Revere's name for a figure that personified the spirit of the young American nation.
A voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore.
If he had included the other riders, would he then need to include the spies, the boatman who rowed Revere across the bay, and the landowner who lent Revere his fastest horse? For Longfellow, the Revere figure stood in for all of these people, and many more.
In the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats